came to office in 2006, he declared a war on drugs, and he sent troops into Juarez and other cities in the north, and that's what kicked off this cycle of violence. It's nowhere close to being a failed state. That is hysteria. I think that's right. But there is a serious crisis in Mexico. And the larger context, of course, is that 100 years ago, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the Mexican Revolution. And so I guess what's called a failed state now back then was called a revolution. So I think Mexicans are acutely aware of that.
And Greg, you mentioned that when Felipe Calderón came to office, obviously we tend to forget that he was elected in perhaps the most controversial election in Mexican history, that a very, very close margin against a leftist candidate, López Obrador. Is there some concern that this increasing militarization, both within Mexico and now possibly from the United States side of the border, will have some impact on the continuing political dynamic within Mexico? Oh,
I think there's a clear concern that the Mexican state, the promise of democratization that happened with the election of PAN and Vicente Fox 2 cycles back has not been delivered. That all three main political bodies, the PAN, the PRI, and the PRD, are losing its ability to channel dissent and protest and popular aspirations through the political process. And you see the growth of social movements and protests, not just in Chiapas, of course, with the Zapatistas, but we saw Oaxaca, so the crisis in Oaxaca, and we saw a lot of the rhetoric of the war on drugs and the war on terror being used to repress dissent in Oaxaca, in Chihuahua. People protesting the privatization of water and other natural resources have been locked up and have been physically repressed under the aegis of the war on terror and the war on drugs. So you're seeing a kind of synergy of all of these different crises coming together in Mexico.
President Obama is weighing the possibility of sending more troops to the border. Do you think some of that you were mentioning having to do with the economy, of many more Mexicans having to come up, of not about drugs, but about people who are being squeezed all over the world? They're
being squeezed. But what's interesting about this particular crisis, I read some statistics that actually in every other economic crisis that Mexico has had throughout the last 30 or 40 years, it's been correlated with an increase of migration to the United States. This is the first time where there's actually a reverse of migration because of the economy tanking in the U.S. And along with that, remittances have fallen. So in some ways, migration has served as a safety valve for Mexican politics since 1968. And what you're seeing is a shutting down of that safety valve, which increases the pressures that Juan was talking about within Mexican society.
I'd like to ask Laura Carlson, if we could get you back in conversation here. For those of us who have had the opportunity from time to cross the border between Mexico and the U.S., there's an amazing difference between how you are treated when you're coming from the U.S. into Mexico versus from Mexico into the U.S. in terms of the type of inspection and processes that you have to go through. As Paul Helmke was suggesting, maybe if the Mexican Army would start searching cars coming from, or trucks coming from the United States into Mexico, they might be able to interdict many of these weapons that are coming in illegally.
Laura, are you there?
Yes.
Could you respond to that?
Well, I think there's a complete double standard in terms of what is really a transnational problem. Everyone recognizes it's a transnational problem, and the way that it's viewed in Mexico and the United States. By talking about spillover and many of the measures the Merida Initiative included that focus only on the Mexican responsibility for this problem, what the United States is doing is washing its hands of these kinds of problems, including the gun running, as well as being the largest market and the reason for existence for these drug cartels. When there's drug activity in the United States, it doesn't mean it's spilling over from Mexico. This is a normal part of the transnational drug trade. The United States is responsible for its share of corruption by letting these kinds of illegal substances into the country, by the illegal trade in guns and money laundering that supports the drug industry on the ground in Mexico and other places. And so by pushing the entire onus of this onto Mexico. It's releasing itself from responsibilities in many ways that's completely unacceptable, and creating an image that there's a contagion coming from the south, which is Mexico, into a fundamentally healthy organism, which is U.S. society, and we all know that isn't true.
Laura Carlson, President Calderon said to say Mexico doesn't have authority over all its national territory is absolutely false and absurd. He said the media is mounting a campaign of lies against Mexico. What do you think has to happen?
Yeah, I think that's basically true. I mean, any definition of a failed state, when you look at it technically and including the rankings that they do of failed states, Mexico does not qualify. There are places where the drug cartels have significant power. It's not that there's a total absence of the state. The drug cartels want to be the state. They don't want to take over the state. What they want to do is they want to carry out their business, a very lucrative business. What I think has to happen is that we have to get rid of this failed drug war model, and we have to start looking at other options. The Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy that was run by former Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo, former Brazilian President Fernando Enrique Cardoso, and former Colombian President Cesar Gaviria came out with a recommendation saying it's time to completely change course on this. What we have to do is start looking at illegal drug use as a public health problem, cease to criminalize it, stop having these confrontations, bloody confrontations in the street with the drug cartels, and focus repressive measures just on organized crime. And at the same time, they came out and suggested that we take a serious look at legalization in some cases of drugs, because the only way this is really going to stop is when that market doesn't exist anymore. And the prohibitionist policies that have been put in place until now have completely failed.
Greg Grandin, on a different note, Salvador elections on Sunday.
Well, the polls show that the election is close. The FMLN candidate, which if he does win, it will end nearly 20 years of Arena right-wing rule. The Arena party being linked to the death squad and the civil war of El Salvador in the 1980s. Mauricio Funes was well ahead in the polls, but there's been a major scare campaign.
That's the candidate of the FMLN.
That's the candidate of the FMLN. There's been a major scare campaign over the last 2 or 3 months along the lines of what happened in Mexico, bringing it back to Mexico with Manuel López Obrador in 2006, which linked him to Chavez, and López Obrador was well ahead in the polls, scheduled to win, and at the last minute it came in very close. Peru, we saw the same thing. So there's been an orchestrated attempt to link Funes with Chavez and also with the FARC in Colombia, and scare Salvadoran voters into voting once again for Arena. We saw the same thing in 2004. Key to this, as you mentioned in the opening, is threatening the temporary protection status. There's about 2.5 million Salvadorans in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of them are here under what's known as a TPS, temporary protection status, that was implemented in, I think, 1989, 1990. It was a recognition of the out-migration exile resulting from the violence of the Civil War in the 1990s. And it's almost been a ritual of U.S. politics every time there's an presidential election in El Salvador to threaten to revoke that TPS status. What you saw in El Salvador was headlines bled along all the right-wing newspapers, which is completely controlled by Arena or affiliated with Arena, announcing that Congress threatens to cut off TPS, and remittances will fall, and all of this alarmism. The Obama administration, the State Department, issued a neutrality statement yesterday. It was about a paragraph long, but it's not getting any attention within the Salvadoran press, and certainly not the headlines that the statements by Dan Burton and other Republican congressmen have received.
Well, we'll certainly follow that story on Monday, what happens with the Salvador elections on Sunday. I want to thank you all for being with us. Greg Grandin, Professor of Latin American History at NYU. His forthcoming book called Fordlandia, The Rise and Fall of Henry Ford's Forgotten Jungle City. Laura Carlson with us from Las Cruces, New Mexico. She is with the Center for International Policy. And finally, Paul Helmke, president of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. When we come back, a debate on a bill that is extremely significant, could change the face of labor in this country. Stay with us.
Thanks.